Welcome back, dear viewers. Today we are traveling to the 1200s. Close your eyes for a moment. When you open them again, we will be standing on the Silk Road.
A messenger races across the steppes of Central Asia. His horse is exhausted. He reaches a station and jumps onto a fresh mount without stopping. The message he carries will travel from the Mongol capital of Karakorum to the armies in Central Europe. The distance is thousands of miles. The time it takes is just 4 to 6 weeks. This was not magic. This was the 1200s. This was the century when the Silk Road reached its absolute peak. Trade networks that had existed for over 1,000 years were completely transformed. The Mongol Empire stretched from Korea in the east to Hungary in the west. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Under Mongol rule, fragmented and dangerous trade routes became a unified superhighway of commerce. More goods moved along these routes in the 1200s than in any previous century. The world of trade would never be the same.
The Silk Road was not a single road.
It was a vast network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. The total length was about 10,000 kilometers. The overland portion alone covered 6,400 kilometers. These routes were established during the Han Dynasty of China around 130 BCE. The term Silk Road was coined much later in 1877 by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. Before the 1200s, the Silk Road was a relay system. Merchants did not travel the entire length. Goods changed hands many times. A merchant in China would sell to a middleman in Central Asia. That middleman would sell to another trader further west. This continued until the goods reached Europe or the Mediterranean. The Sogdian merchants were the masters of this system. They dominated trade for over 1,000 years from the 2nd century BCE to the 10th century CE. Their language became the common language of trade across Asia. They were the essential middlemen who connected East and West, but the Silk Road was never stable. Political changes constantly disrupted trade. The Tang dynasty of China collapsed between 755 and 763 CE during the An Lushan Rebellion. This rebellion devastated trade networks. The routes became dangerous. Kingdoms along the path fought each other constantly. Bandits raided caravans. Nomadic tribes demanded tribute from merchants. By the 10th to 12th centuries, the overland Silk Road had declined significantly. Maritime trade routes offered real competition. Traveling by sea cost only 1/5 of what overland transport cost. Many merchants chose ships over caravans when possible. Still, some great cities thrived along the routes. Merv, in present-day Turkmenistan, was the largest city in the world by the early 1200s. Its population exceeded 500,000 people. Samarkand and Bukhara in Central Asia were important trading centers, but these cities existed in a fragmented world. There was limited direct contact between China and Europe. The journey was too dangerous and too complicated.
Everything changed when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes in 1206.
He began a series of conquests that would reshape Eurasia. His initial approach was brutal. When cities resisted, he destroyed them completely. In 1220 and 1221, the great cities of Bukhara and Samarkand were burned to the ground. The city of Merv fell in 1221. The entire population of 500,000 was massacred, but Genghis Khan had a strategic vision. He controlled the northern trade routes. He destroyed competitors along the southern routes. This forced trade to flow through territories under Mongol control. It was ruthless, but it worked. The real transformation came under Genghis Khan's son, Ögedei Khan, who ruled from 1229 to 1241. Ögedei understood that an empire needed more than military conquest. It needed institutions and infrastructure. In 1235, he founded Karakorum as the permanent Mongol capital. This was the first time the nomadic Mongols built a real city. It was located in central Mongolia along the Orkhon River. Ögedei implemented crucial reforms. In 1234, he formalized the Yam postal system that his father had begun. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. This meant a merchant could trade in China using the same measurements used in Persia. He introduced census-taking for taxation. This created predictable revenue and reduced corruption. He even experimented with paper currency in northern China, backed by silk reserves. By 1260, the Mongol Empire had reached its maximum extent. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. It covered roughly 2/3 of the Old World. This created something unprecedented. For the first time in history, a single political authority controlled nearly the entire Silk Road. Competing kingdoms that had fought over trade routes were gone. The dozens of tribute collectors that merchants had to pay were eliminated. Security improved dramatically. This period became known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. It did not mean there were no wars. The Mongols still fought on their frontiers. But within the empire, travel became safer than it had been for centuries. A merchant could now travel from China to Persia without crossing hostile borders. This was revolutionary.
The Yam postal system was the backbone of Mongol control.
The Yam postal system was the backbone of Mongol control. Without it, the vast empire would have been impossible to govern. The system consisted of relay stations called Tur. These stations were placed every 20 to 40 miles across the entire empire. At each station, fresh horses waited. Food and shelter were provided. Guards protected the facilities. The Mongols dedicated 50,000 horses solely to the postal service. Riders could cover between 200 and 300 kilometers per day. That is roughly 125 miles in 24 hours. A single rider would swap horses up to 10 times in one day. When a messenger arrived at a station, he would immediately mount a fresh horse and continue. Sometimes he would pass his message to another rider who would carry it to the next station. This relay system operated every hour of every day without stopping. The speed was extraordinary. A message from Karakorum to the Caspian Sea took only a few weeks. This was thousands of miles. No other land-based communication system would match this speed until the invention of the telegraph 600 years later. The Yam was faster than the famous Pony Express that Americans would create in the 1800s. Different animals were used for different terrain. In harsh mountain regions, yaks carried messages. In desert areas, camels were used. In the cold regions of Manchuria and southern Siberia, the Mongols even used dog sled teams. The system adapted to local conditions. Access to the Yam required a special passport called a paisa. This was a metal tablet that granted the bearer the right to use postal stations. Mongol officials carried these. Foreign diplomats and important merchants could be granted them. Military messengers could use the system without a paisa. This allowed rapid mobilization of armies across vast distances. European travelers documented the system in detail. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine visited Mongolia in 1245. He carried a letter from Pope Innocent IV to the Mongol leaders. He traveled 5,500 miles to reach Karakorum. William of Rubruck made a similar journey in 1253. Marco Polo used the system extensively beginning in 1271. All of them praised its efficiency and reliability. The Yam did more than carry messages. It enabled the entire administrative structure of the empire. Tax records moved along the routes. Census data was collected and transmitted. Military intelligence flowed to commanders. Legal decisions from the capital reached distant provinces. When the Great Khan died, the news reached Mongol armies in Central Europe within 4 to 6 weeks. This allowed coordinated responses across the empire. The system also became available to merchants. Trading caravans could stop at postal stations for resupply. This reduced the cost and risk of long-distance travel. What had been built for government became infrastructure for commerce.
The Mongols did not just allow trade, they actively promoted it.
This was unusual. Many earlier empires looked down on merchants. Chinese Confucian society ranked merchants below farmers and artisans. Persian aristocrats often despised trade. The Mongols took a different approach. Genghis Khan and his successors elevated the status of merchants. Traders were given legal protection under Mongol law. They were guaranteed safe passage across borders. Mongol garrisons were established along trade routes to protect caravans from bandits. These were not symbolic guards. They were real military forces that patrolled actively. The financial support was remarkable. Mongol leaders often paid more than the asking price for goods from merchants. This incentivized traders to bring their caravans to Mongol territories. Tax exemptions were granted to foreign merchants. This made trading in the empire highly profitable. The Mongols also provided direct loans and financial backing to merchant enterprises. A special institution called the Ortog was created. These were merchant protection associations. They provided insurance and support for traders. If a merchant lost goods to bandits or natural disaster, the Ortog would help compensate the loss. This reduced the enormous risks of long-distance trade. The infrastructure improvements were substantial. The Mongols built and maintained roads across their empire. Bridges were constructed over rivers. Caravanserai were expanded. These were fortified rest stops where merchants could sleep safely and store goods. They had walls for protection and facilities for animals. Some caravanserai could house hundreds of travelers at once. The customs system was unified. Before the Mongols, a merchant traveling from China to Europe might pay dozens of different customs fees to different kingdoms. Each border meant negotiation and delay. Under Mongol rule, the system was standardized. Fees were predictable. Bureaucracy was reduced. This dramatically lowered transaction costs. The results were visible in the composition of traders. Genoese merchant families from Italy established permanent residences in Chinese port cities. Venetian traders like the Polo family could travel safely to China and back. Persian, Arab, and Turkish merchants moved freely across the empire. The Mongol capital of Karakorum attracted traders from every corner of the known world. Italian city-states became the gateways between Asia and Europe. Venice dominated trade in the eastern Mediterranean. Its power grew enormously during the 1200s. After the Fourth Crusade, Venice controlled most of the Adriatic ports that had belonged to Byzantium. Genoa competed fiercely for the Asian trade. Even smaller cities like Pisa participated in the commerce. These cities became wealthy beyond measure from Silk Road trade.
The volume and variety of goods moving along the Silk Road was unprecedented.
Trade flowed in both directions, carrying the products of different civilizations. From east to west, Chinese goods dominated. Silk remained the primary commodity. It was the perfect trade good because it had high value but low weight. Caravans were limited in how much they could carry. Every merchant wanted to maximize profit per pound of cargo. Silk was ideal. It could be compressed into bolts. It did not spoil. It was desperately desired in the West. Silk had become more than a luxury fabric in China. During the Tang dynasty, it was collected as a form of tax. In some regions, it functioned as currency. The city of Turfan used silk for local transactions. Historical estimates suggest that ancient Rome exported as much as 130 tons of gold annually just to buy silk. The European appetite for this fabric was enormous. Chinese porcelain was the second major export. The techniques for making high-quality porcelain were unknown in the West. Chinese craftsmen during the Tang and Yuan periods produced ceramics that amazed European buyers. These pieces were shipped carefully in straw-packed crates across thousands of miles. Spices from China and Southeast Asia traveled west in huge quantities. Historical records show that spices reached their peak popularity in Europe during the 1200s and 1300s. A medieval food expert named Paul Friedman calculated that roughly 75% of medieval European recipes involved spices. When the King of Scotland visited the King of England in 1194, he received a daily gift of 4 pounds of cinnamon and 2 pounds of pepper. This was far more than one person could use. It was a display of wealth and access to trade goods. Paper was another revolutionary export. It had been invented in China during the Han Dynasty. The technology spread slowly westward. By 751, CE papermaking reached Baghdad after the Battle of Talas. By the 1200s and 1300s, paper finally arrived in Europe. This completely changed European society. Before, paper books were rare and expensive. They were written on parchment made from animal skins. Paper made books cheaper. It enabled the later printing revolution. Mass communication became possible. Other Chinese exports included tea, gunpowder, lacquerware, and bronze products. Each of these items was highly valued in Western markets. From west to east, different goods flowed. Horses were perhaps the ultimate luxury item. They provided their own transportation, which made them unique. Central Asian horses were far superior to Chinese breeds. Chinese sources called them winged horses because they were so much faster and stronger than local animals. Every Chinese dynasty needed horses for cavalry and warfare. The silk for horse trade was one of the most important exchanges on the Silk Road. China would trade enormous quantities of silk for relatively few high-quality horses. Woolen goods were completely unknown in the Eastern empires. Sheep were not widely raised in China. When woolen carpets, rugs, blankets, and clothes arrived from Central Asia and the Mediterranean, they amazed Chinese buyers. The weaving techniques were foreign. The softness and warmth were remarkable. A whole new market opened. Glassware from Rome and Samarkand was prized in China and Japan. Archaeological digs have found Roman glass in Chinese tombs. The transparency and quality of Western glass could not be matched by Eastern craftsmen. It was considered a rare luxury. Gold and silver flowed eastward in enormous quantities. These were the primary means of payment for Eastern goods. The Roman Empire was a major exporter of precious metals. Silver also came from Central Asian mines and from Persia. Persian craftsmen created elaborate silver items decorated with intricate patterns. These became status symbols in Chinese courts. From India and Central Asia came their own specialties. Spices like pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and nutmeg originated in India and Southeast Asia. They traveled through Central Asian middlemen to reach both China and Europe. Indian cotton textiles and muslins were famous for their fine weave. Semi-precious stones were mined in India and traded along the routes. Ivory from India and Africa moved along connected trade networks. Dyes for coloring fabrics came from various regions. Each area contributed what it produced best.
The explosion of trade created and transformed cities along the Silk Road.
These became cosmopolitan centers where cultures mixed freely. Karakoram stood as the symbol of Mongol power and openness. Built in 1235 by Ögedei Khan, it was designed to be a permanent capital. For a nomadic people, this was revolutionary. The city attracted people from across the empire and beyond. Within its walls stood 12 Buddhist temples, 2 mosques, and 1 Christian church. This physical diversity reflected Mongol religious tolerance. All faiths were permitted to practice and build. The city featured a massive silver fountain commissioned by Ögedei. It was designed by a captured French craftsman. The fountain could dispense 3,000 measures of wine, arak, and other liquors daily. It became famous across Asia and Europe. Travelers wrote detailed descriptions of its engineering and decoration. Karakoram drew artisans from across Eurasia. Chinese craftsmen lived alongside Persian architects. Russian goldsmiths worked near Indian gem cutters. The city was subsidized by the imperial treasury. After the capital moved to Beijing in 1260, Karakoram became an outpost. But it remained important as a symbol of what Mongol trade had created. Samarkand in present-day Uzbekistan had an ancient history. But the 1200s brought massive changes. When Genghis Khan captured the city in 1220, he destroyed it. The population was massacred or scattered. But by 1370, Samarkand experienced a revival under Timur, also called Tamerlane. He made it the capital of his empire. By the late 1300s, its population was larger than it is today. Samarkand became a center of science and learning. An observatory was built there in 1420. Scholars gathered to study astronomy and mathematics. The city's location at the crossroads of trade routes from China, India, Persia, and Europe made it incredibly wealthy. Merchants from every direction met in its markets. The famous traveler Ibn Battuta visited in 1333 and called it one of the greatest and finest of cities. Kashgar in western China sat at a crucial junction. Routes from China, Central Asia, and South Asia all met there. The city benefited from incredibly fertile land. The Kashgar River flooded annually, depositing rich soil. Farmers grew corn, rice, cotton, melons, apricots, and cherries. This agricultural abundance fed the trading population. The Sunday bazaar in Kashgar became legendary. Merchants traveled thousands of miles to attend. Goods from 3 continents were bought and sold. Local production added to the variety. Kashgar was famous for textiles and pottery. Craftsmen developed techniques influenced by Chinese, Persian, and Indian styles. Yangzhou in China provides evidence of permanent European settlement. In the 20th century, archaeologists discovered tombstones of 2 Italian siblings. Caterina Viglione died in 1342. Her brother Antonio died in 1344. They had lived their entire adult lives in China. They were not unique. Communities of foreign merchants established themselves in Chinese cities. They married locally. They learned Chinese. They became permanent residents while maintaining their cultural identities. These cosmopolitan centers showed what Silk Road trade made possible. People who would never have met were living as neighbors. Languages mixed. Architectural styles blended. Foods from different regions appeared in local markets. The 1200s created truly international cities centuries before the modern era.
Physical goods were only part of what moved along the Silk Road.
Ideas, knowledge, religions, and technologies traveled alongside silk and spices. Religious exchange accelerated dramatically in the 1200s. Buddhism had spread from India to China in earlier centuries, but the Mongol period saw continued evolution. Buddhist texts were translated into new languages. Teachers traveled between monasteries in different countries. The mixing of Buddhist traditions from various regions created new schools of thought. Islam expanded significantly through merchant networks. Muslim traders often served as the first representatives of their faith in new regions. They built mosques in trading cities. They married into local populations. Islamic law and culture spread through commercial contacts rather than conquest in many areas. Christianity reached farther east than ever before. Nestorian Christianity had existed in Central Asia for centuries. But under Mongol rule, Catholic missionaries traveled all the way to China. John of Montecorvino became Archbishop of Beijing. He founded Roman Catholic missions in both India and China. He translated the New Testament into the Mongolian language. For several decades, an active Catholic church existed in China. The Mongols practiced religious tolerance as policy. This was pragmatic rather than philosophical. They wanted to rule effectively over diverse populations. Forcing religious conversion would have created rebellions. Instead, they allowed all religions to coexist. In Karakoram, a traveler could see Muslims and Christians living and working alongside Buddhists and practitioners of traditional Mongol shamanism. This religious diversity was remarkable for the era. Technological transfer had enormous long-term consequences. Paper-making technology spread from China westward. It reached Samarkand around 700 CE. From there, it moved to Baghdad. Muslim scholars and craftsmen refined the techniques. By the 1200s and 1300s, paper reached Europe through Islamic Spain and Sicily. The impact on Europe cannot be overstated. Paper enabled the mass production of books. This laid the groundwork for Johannes Gutenberg's printing press in the 1440s. Printed books created a revolution in communication and education. The Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment all depended on cheap paper and printing. The chain started with technology moving along the Silk Road. Gunpowder followed a similar path from China to the West. The military applications were obvious. But gunpowder also changed mining, construction, and eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. Printing techniques also traveled westward. Block printing was known in China centuries before Europe learned the method. Medical knowledge moved in both directions. During the reign of Kublai Khan in China and under the Ilkhanid Mongol regime in Iran, there was extensive exchange of doctors and medical texts. Chinese acupuncture techniques became known in Persia. Persian and Arab medical knowledge, including surgery and pharmacology, reached China. The long-term impact was limited because the exchanges stopped when the Mongol Empire fragmented. But for several decades, medical professionals from different traditions worked together. Astronomical knowledge also crossed borders. Observatories in Samarkand and Beijing exchanged data and techniques. The accuracy of star catalogues improved through this collaboration. Commercial innovations may have had the most practical impact. Bills of exchange were introduced to Europe from Islamic finance. These were essentially checks that allowed merchants to transfer money without carrying gold. Deposit banking developed to support long-distance trade. Insurance practices spread to reduce risk. Accounting methods became more standardized. These innovations made commerce more efficient and less dangerous. Credit systems allowed merchants to invest in larger ventures. Paper money was used extensively in China, and the Mongols tried to spread this practice westward with limited success. Artisans moved along with goods and ideas. During the second half of the 1200s, there was particularly extensive exchange. Many artisans were conscripted and forced to relocate. The Mongols would capture craftsmen in one region and move them to another. A Chinese porcelain maker might be sent to work in Persia. A Persian metal worker might be brought to China. While this was often involuntary, it created remarkable artistic fusion. Chinese porcelain makers began incorporating Persian decorative designs. Persian carpet weavers adapted Central Asian geometric patterns. The artistic styles that emerged were hybrid creations that would not have existed without Silk Road exchange.
The same networks that carried goods and ideas also transmitted disease.
The Black Death pandemic of the mid-1300s was the most catastrophic consequence of Silk Road connectivity. The bubonic plague originated in Central Asia. The exact location remains debated, but most historians believe it came from the steppes. The plague bacterium lived in rodent populations. Fleas carried it from rats to humans. Once human-to-human transmission began, the disease spread rapidly. The efficient trade routes of the Silk Road became highways for plague. Merchants and travelers carried infected fleas in their cargo and clothing. The disease moved from Central Asia westward to the Middle East and Europe. It also spread eastward into China. Ships in the Indian Ocean trade network carried plague to new ports. Europe was devastated. The Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities lost half their inhabitants. The social and economic consequences lasted for generations. Labor shortages changed power dynamics between peasants and lords. The plague may have contributed to the end of feudalism in Western Europe. China also suffered massive population loss, though exact figures are harder to determine. The Middle East and Central Asia were hit hard. The interconnected world that Silk Road trade had created meant that disease could spread farther and faster than ever before in human history. The Mongols had no concept of quarantine or disease control. They did not understand how plague spread. Their policies of keeping trade routes open and moving people across vast distances created perfect conditions for pandemic transmission. The very efficiency of the YAM system meant infected individuals could cover huge distances before showing symptoms. This was the terrible cost of globalization. The same networks that enriched civilizations also made them vulnerable in new ways. Diseases that might have remained local outbreaks became continental catastrophes.
The economic transformation of the 1200s can be measured in multiple ways.
The volume of trade increased dramatically. Historical sources describe astonishing quantities of goods moving along the routes. Exact statistics do not exist. Medieval merchants did not publish trade data the way modern companies do. but every available source agrees that the 1200s saw more commerce than any previous century. The wealth generated by Silk Road trade created a new merchant class. These were not aristocrats or landowners. They were traders who accumulated fortunes through commerce. In Italian city-states, merchant families became more powerful than old nobility. The Polo family of Venice was one example among thousands. These merchants funded art and architecture. They sponsored universities. They changed the social structure of their societies. Taxation from trade provided enormous revenue to governments. The Mongols taxed trade, but not excessively. They understood that moderate taxes on large volumes generated more revenue than high taxes on small volumes. The money funded Mongol administration and military. It paid for the infrastructure that made more trade possible. This created a positive cycle. Better infrastructure enabled more trade, which generated more tax revenue, which funded better infrastructure. The geographic reach of trade expanded. Before the Mongols, direct contact between Europe and China was extremely rare. By the late 1200s, it was common. European merchants lived in Chinese cities. Chinese goods reached European markets in months rather than years. The entire Eurasian continent was more connected than at any time before the modern era. The Golden Horde controlled the northern trade routes during the 1300s and 1400s. This was the Mongol state that ruled from Siberia to Eastern Europe. Its capital was Sarai Berg. The caravan routes went from China through Otrar and Khwarezm to the lower Volga region, then to Azov and the Crimea, and finally to Europe. This northern route dominated international trade for over a century. Most caravans bypassed the traditional routes through Transoxiana. They went directly north of the Caspian Sea to the Volga, then west to the Black Sea. This shift was possible only because of Mongol control. Economic integration reached new levels. The attempts at standardized currency were not fully successful. Paper money worked in China, but Europeans did not trust it. However, standardized weights and measures did spread widely. A merchant could use the same units of measurement in multiple countries. This reduced disputes and delays. Transaction costs fell. More merchants could participate in long-distance trade because the system was more predictable. The Silk Road trade of the 1200s created what historians now call the first truly intercontinental economy. Prices in China affected markets in Europe. Disruptions in Central Asia impacted Mediterranean trade. The economic systems of distant civilizations became linked in ways that would not be seen again until the Age of Exploration 200 years later.
The transformation of the 1200s did not last forever.
By the late 1300s and 1400s, the system began to decline. Multiple factors contributed. The Mongol Empire fragmented after 1260. It divided into separate khanates. The Yuan dynasty ruled China. The Golden Horde controlled the western steppes. The Ilkhanate governed Persia and the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia. These divisions created borders again. Local rivalries reduced cooperation between Khanate rulers. The unified political control that had made the Pax Mongolica possible was gone. The Yam postal system became patchy. Without central coordination, the relay stations fell into disrepair. Some Khanates maintained their sections well. Others let infrastructure decay. Corruption crept into the system. Station masters demanded bribes. Horses were not always available. The speed and reliability that had made the system remarkable declined. Maritime trade routes continued to offer real competition. Sea travel still cost only 1/5 of what overland transport cost. As shipbuilding technology improved and navigation became more precise, the ocean routes became even more attractive. Merchants who could ship by sea often chose to do so. European production of formerly Eastern goods reduced demand. By the 1100s, Italian city-states had begun producing their own silk. The techniques had been smuggled west centuries earlier. By the 1400s, Lyon in France had become a major silk production center. Europe was supplying much of its own demand. Similarly, Europeans learned to make porcelain by the 1700s. What had been exotic imports became domestic products. Chinese policy changed dramatically in the 1400s. The Ming dynasty replaced the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368. The Ming emperors pursued isolationism. They officially stopped Silk Road trade. They turned inward, focusing on Chinese self-sufficiency. This removed one of the two major endpoints of the trade routes. Without Chinese participation, the system could not function at the same scale. The Black Death had ongoing effects. Repeated plague outbreaks in the 1300s and 1400s disrupted trade. Populations declined. Demand for luxury goods fell when people were struggling to survive. The psychological impact made people fearful of foreign contact and foreign goods. By 1453, the Ottoman Empire had conquered Constantinople. The Ottomans controlled much of the land route between Asia and Europe. They imposed restrictions and high taxes on trade passing through their territories. This made the overland routes less profitable. European merchants began seeking alternative routes to Asia. This search would eventually lead to the Age of Exploration and the discovery of sea routes around Africa to India and beyond.
The 1200s stand as the pivot point in Silk Road history.
Before this century, the routes were fragmented, dangerous, and unreliable. Local kingdoms fought over control. Merchants faced constant threats. Trade existed, but it was limited and expensive. The Mongol conquest changed everything. Genghis Khan and his successors created political unity across most of Eurasia. They built infrastructure specifically to support trade. The Yam postal system provided communication and transportation. Merchant protection policies made commerce profitable. Religious tolerance allowed people of different faiths to trade peacefully. The result was an explosion of exchange. More goods moved in the 1200s than in any previous century. Silk, porcelain, and spices flowed westward. Horses, gold, and woolen goods traveled east. Cities along the routes became cosmopolitan centers where cultures mixed. Ideas and technologies crossed continents. Paper and gunpowder spread from China to the west, changing European history forever. Religious traditions encountered each other, creating new syntheses. But there were costs. The same networks that carried goods also transmitted the Black Death. The plague devastated populations across 3 continents. Disease moved as efficiently as ideas along the well-maintained trade routes. The innovations of the 1200s created foundations that lasted long after Mongol power declined. Commercial practices like bills of exchange and insurance spread throughout the world. The concept of protecting merchants and maintaining infrastructure for trade became standard policy for later empires. The 1200s proved that transcontinental cooperation was possible and profitable. The Silk Road of the 1200s demonstrated both the benefits and dangers of globalization. Interconnected economies created wealth and spread knowledge. They also created new vulnerabilities. This is a lesson still relevant today as our modern world grows ever more connected. The Mongol century showed what unified political will combined with practical support for commerce could achieve. It created the first truly global economy, and in doing so, changed the world forever.
That was the Silk Road of the 1200s, the century that connected the world. How did you like it? Many thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more time travels.